Hello, and welcome to the Dark Ages podcast. This is episode 54, Basking in Glory. At times I feel like I have a habit of assuming too much prior knowledge on the part of all of you wonderful listeners. For instance, I kind of assume that you have all listened to Mike Duncan's History of Rome all the way through at least once, since this podcast is intended as a successor to it. But of course I've never actually said that, so I'm sorry if there have been things along the way that were unclear. If I refer to something you are unfamiliar with, I also assume that you are the kind of smart, engaged, and curious people who will go and look it up, and that is an assumption I shall continue to hold tight to my heart, with no designs for alteration or abrogation, because it is what I want to believe. The point of all that nonsense is that when I refer to the Basques, the subject of today's episode, I should not assume that you know who or what I am talking about. It's who, by the way. So let me put that right now. The Basques are an ethnic group of unknown origin living in the Western Pyrenees of northern Spain and southwest France. Simple enough. The word Basque may also refer to their language, which is entirely unrelated to its neighbors, and is not even Indo-European. The Basques' own name for their language is Euskara, which I will be using henceforth, both because it means I won't have to signpost whether I'm talking about the language or the people, and because it's a nice euphonious word. Euskara. Okay, so we're clear who I'm talking about. Okay, how about why we're talking about them? Well, the most immediate reason is because I was interested and wanted to. More broadly, though, it was because it gives an opportunity to look a little more closely at the kind of pressures and changes happening in the 5th and 6th century, since it's all taking place in a much more circumscribed area than the grand narrative that we've been following, lo these many episodes. It also is an opportunity to do some ethnography, which is something I haven't gotten to do since the early episodes on the Franks. For the first time, I am telling you about a group of people that still exists as an active ethnic community. Outside the halls of rhetoric, I don't think anybody's running around these days claiming to be an Ostrogoth or a Visigoth, a Vandal or even a Frank. And yet, there the Basques are, living in northern Spain and southern France, where they always have been. And that means that this episode has the potential to become a little bit contentious if I'm not careful, since the Basques' relationships with those two countries have not always been harmonious, especially in the 20th century. My understanding is that those relationships have been steadily improving lately, but without direct experience, I can't really know for sure where sensitivities may still remain. It will not keep me from punning in the episode title, though, as you may have already noticed. It would take far more than the possibility of social media outrage to do that. So, Spanish listeners, if you have any insights that you can share, please do get in touch, however is most convenient to you. You make up about 0.75% of my audience, but I'm sure at least one of the 6 of you will be able to correct me about something. So, my guiding light is going to be to strictly work my own furrow, and tell the story of the Basques up until roughly the Arab invasion of Iberia at the beginning of the 8th century. Hope that's not a spoiler for anybody. That will take us a bit beyond where we've reached in the main narrative, but it shouldn't disrupt anything there. Spoilers, again, the history of the Basques runs into the blackest of documentary holes right about there, so there will be no great and dramatic break at the end of this thing. Let's start by setting the scene. We're talking about the western end of the Pyrenees mountain range, right where the Atlantic coast of France veers from north-south and changes to the east-west coast of Spain. The mountains gradually drop off in height as you follow them westward, and then continue on as the Cantabrian range, following the Spanish coast. The mountains cast a rain shadow, so on the northern seaward side they are, or were, heavily forested and lush, while on the southern side the upper Ebro Valley and central plateau are semi-arid and warmer. Today, the Basque country officially includes the Spanish provinces of Vizcaya, Guipuzcoa, Álava, and Navarra, as well as the western half of the Pyrénées Pyrénées-Atlantique department of France, though the vagaries of history have meant the territories occupied by the Basques has expanded and shrunk beyond those modern borders. The terrain makes the region remote, but not impossible or completely isolated. The passes over the mountains have been well known and regularly used for thousands of years. In terms of cities, the larger, more famous ones today are Bilbao, San Sebastian, and Pamplona in Spain, and Bayonne in France. And I will mention a few others along the way. There will be a map on the episode page at darkagespod.com, and I will put links in the show notes on this episode. I anticipate there actually might be several maps. You lucky, lucky things. And by the way, sorry to interrupt myself, but it has come to my attention that the links that I put in the episode descriptions to things like, maps and sources and images do not work on Spotify. That is irritating since 80% of you listen on Spotify. I just became aware of this and will be working on finding a solution so that you can more easily access the website. Sorry, I just didn't know. The ongoing, and probably ultimately unanswerable mystery of the Basques is whether they represent a population that has occupied the mountains in unbroken continuity all the way back to the Stone Age, or are a later introduction. Have they always been there? And if not, when did they arrive? Evidence for the earliest human settlements in the vast gulf of time between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago is limited to a handful of finds in the region. It's extremely likely that the last ice age marked a complete break in the continuity of human settlement, and any attempt to connect the present population to those deepest of ancient Cro-Magnon settlers can really have no solid foundation. As the glaciers receded and the Neolithic period dawned, finds now become more common. I'm talking here now about the period between about 4000 and 2000 BCE. These are the most concentrated in Alava, where simple, undecorated pots are found, with a few further finds in neighboring Nabarra. Given the absence of clear answers, I can't describe the Stone Age archaeology and then say these are all definitely the ancestors of today's Basques. All I can do is describe what the finds do tell us and emphasize that there's a huge asterisk hanging over all of it. Stone Age finds appear in caves at higher elevations and in open-air clusters farther down in the valleys. There's no significant difference between these finds other than their setting, which suggests that the same culture used both. Given the climate, the most likely interpretation is that the earliest settlers were largely pastoralists, who practiced transhumance. That is to say, they practiced animal husbandry and used the lower settlements in the winter, and then drove their flocks or herds to higher pastures in the summer, where they would use the naturally occurring caves as shelter. There's also no material difference between the artifacts found in the Core Mountain region and those found in neighboring areas, meaning the areas outside the Basque region. One difference that does appear, though, between the two areas is the presence of dolmens. A dolmen is a megalithic structure with large stones standing on end with a roof stone on top to form an enclosed space. These are often interpreted as tombs, but not necessarily. It's also conceivable that the dolmens of the Basque country were set up as shelters for herdsmen in their annual cycle. Artificial caves, if you will. Dolmens are only found in the central part of the region, mainly in Alava and Guipuzcoa, and can be added to the pile of prehistoric mysteries. Maps and images, of course, website, Instagram. The so-called Neolithic Revolution spread across Europe in these millennia as people gave up hunting and gathering, or pastoralism, in favor of planted agriculture. It appears to have been delayed on its way up into the valleys of the Pyrenees, though. Arable farming seems to have arrived much later there, along with bronze, perhaps between 2000 and 900 BCE. Whether that was due to climate or isolation or a mixture, we can't know. Planting never completely took over as the sole means of sustenance. For all of the time that we'll be talking about today, a combination of arable and transhuman pastoralism was the economic model of the mountains. The arrival of bronze working seems to have come as the result of cultural diffusion from outside, not the arrival of a new group of people. And that makes sense for a largely pastoral society. We've talked before, a long time ago, about the necessary relationship between settled planters and nomadic herdsmen. The herders could not keep all their animals over winter and usually had a surplus of dairy products and raw materials like wool and hides. These they could trade for needed goods with their more settled neighbors, like pottery or tools. When trade was impossible, in times of hardship for example, then raiding might be required, but the pastoralist needed and benefited from the farmer and vice versa. Through these trading relationships, knowledge of metalworking spread. It also explains the absence of a clear distinction in the material cultures of the region. The slow diffusion of Bronze Age technology stands in stark contrast to the arrival of the Iron Age in the Basque country. Iron Age finds are found almost entirely in the Ebro Valley and along the lower parts of its tributaries, far from the high country. There's very little overlap between the Dolmen region and the Iron Age finds, which may be meaningful or maybe not. The Iron Age finds usually take the form of hill forts and fortified settlements, suggesting a new element of violence has arrived. Some interpret this as the appearance and invasion of an outside force coming to colonize and impose itself on the native inhabitants of the region. The settlements seem to have appeared in two waves, one between 900 and 600 BCE, the other between 500 and 200 BCE. The latter wave, a Celtiberian influence, can be detected in the style of artifacts found. None of this culture appears in the higher valleys, so it is argued that the Celts of Iberia were not the ancestors of today's Basques. Given this prehistory, we can probably safely conclude that the mysterious Euskara language arrived in the Western Pyrenees no later than around 600 BCE, if it arrived with that first wave of Iron Age invaders, and most probably was earlier than that. That's my take on it anyway. Linguistics is key to the argument about origins, but far from clear-cut. Everyone agrees that Euskara is not an Indo-European language, and is the only such language surviving in Western Europe. What no one can agree on is what language family it does belong to, or when its first speakers appeared, or where. There have been attempts to link Euskara to the Pictish language, but that effort crashed and burned so completely that you'll rarely see it even mentioned anymore. It is largely agreed now that the Picts spoke some variation of Brythonic, which is a Celtic and therefore an Indo-European language. There are other non-Indo-European languages in Europe, notably Hungarian, Finnish, and Estonian, but the origins of all of them are well established in the historical record. And they are all much more recently introduced to their current homelands, and no solid connection between them and the language of the Basques holds up to close scrutiny. Euskara appears to be unique among modern languages in Europe. Euskara does seem to be related to the now extinct language of the Aquitani, the tribe that occupied southwestern Gaul prior to the arrival of Julius Caesar. The Aquitani left inscriptions which tell us that their language was unrelated to the Celtic languages around them, and similar to Euskara. Its classification, as you can probably guess, is just as murky as Euskara's. The earliest source for written Euskara is on an artifact called the Hand of Irulegui, which gives a +2 buff to all checks against intelligence and turns undead at a level 5. No, sorry. What the hand is a flat piece of bronze cut into the shape of a human hand. It was found in 2021 in Navarra. The hand bears inscriptions across the back in 4 lines. Its meaning and purpose are not well understood, though based on where it was placed, it may have hung on the door of a house as a talisman. The writing is identifiably a form of Euskara, though translation is difficult, and written in the northeastern Iberian script, a descendant of the Phoenician alphabet. It is the only object of its type found anywhere in Iberia, though similar objects are sometimes found in the Levant. And like most things related to the origins of the Basques, the Hands of Irulegui raises more questions than it answers. But it is the latest thing, and I would have been remiss had I not mentioned it. Before we move out of prehistory entirely, I want to give a brief nod to genetics. Now, I will be honest, I arrived at the genetics question at the end of my research and have not had time to properly dive in on it, so this is going to be the lightest and gentlest scratch of the surface. And apologies in advance for any grievous error. Corrections, as always, are welcome. So, studies of mitochondrial DNA, which is passed matrilineally, show that the Basques are largely consistent with the rest of Western Europe. 2 main haplogroups are present, the J group and the U group. In the Basque country, a variation of the U group, called U8A, developed and is native to the area, though it is hard to say when it appeared. A study of Y chromosome DNA, which is patrilineal, shows the haplogroup R1b as most common in the Basque country, with 91% bearing the marker, whereas in Wales, 89% bear it, and in Ireland, 81% bear it. So that suggests a relationship between the Basques and the Celtic settlers, or at least the early settlers of Wales and Ireland. One suggestion is that the British Isles were a refuge for Proto-Basque people during the last Ice Age, although why one would travel north to flee an Ice Age is not at all clear to me. That all is fascinating, but it doesn't shed much light on origins. In 2015, a study concluded that the Basques were a combination of Iberian farmers who had been intermixed with Neolithic pastoralists and hunters before becoming isolated. That isolation began at least 3,000 years ago, so around 1000 BCE, just before the arrival of those Iron Age fort builders I mentioned. So that makes everything clear as mud, and I almost wish I hadn't mentioned it. Let's move on to the slightly firmer ground of actual documentary evidence. Historical evidence related to the Basque country arrives with the Romans, as you might have expected. The earliest mention of the people of the area are of a cohort of slave soldiers belonging to Gaius Marius in 87 BCE. The geographer Strabo mentioned 3 tribes occupying the Western Pyrenees, the Alatriges, the Bardetier, or sometimes called the Varduli, and the Vascones. Vascones is the source of both words Basque and Gascon. Marius's men were Varduli. These 3 tribes are generally accepted as the forebearers of the modern Basques, but again, it's a conclusion drawn from limited evidence rather than hard, clear association. Strabo mentions that the 3 tribes' societies were matriarchal, an assertion that is repeated in many later sources. And though women in Basque society have enjoyed overall greater independence and influence compared to their neighbors, there is no remnant of matriarchy or matrilineal inheritance practices that survives in the modern or even pre-modern eras. If you think back to episode 47, Roman Hispania, you may remember that it took some time for the conquest of Iberia to be completed, and that the northern mountains were the most bitterly contested. You might think that included the Basque tribes, but it seems to have been more true for the Cantabri, further west in the central part of the coastal mountains. Roman remains in the Basque country are relatively sparse, compared to the rest of Hispania. The climate wasn't conducive to the cash crops that would have attracted large villa-based production. The mountains were of little interest to the elites of the empire since there seemed to be little wealth that could be extracted from them. But that is not to say there was no Roman presence. There aren't a lot of luxury goods or opulent architecture to be found, but Roman and Roman-style artifacts are found all over the region. Pottery, mosaics, decorative bronze work. The quality of the work never rises above what we might call provincial. It's no match for the kind of thing found in the large urban centers like Tarragona or Seville, but it is very much present. Given that first contact with the Romans would have been around 100 BCE, and then been continuous for over 500 years, it would be surprising if a degree of Romanization didn't take place. The Romans themselves didn't seem to have considered the Basque country a dangerous frontier. Military finds suggest that only one cohort was stationed there, probably at Iruña, near modern-day Vitoria. A larger force was stationed further west, at the edge of Galicia, well removed from the lands of the Vascones. The Iruña cohort was likely no more than 1,000 men, and probably split up across multiple garrison posts. Their most likely function was to protect commerce on the main road, leading from Astorga to Bordeaux from bandits. It is certainly not a force large enough to keep a lid on any kind of rebellious populace. The presence of such a large artery of trade running through the region at all also speaks to its relative peacefulness. The Vascones were integrated into the imperial military system as well. A cohort known as the Prima Fida Vardulorum Civium Romanum had guarded Hadrian's Wall, with the promise of Roman citizenship upon discharge. Also in Britannia, in Northumberland, an inscription is found in a Roman fort commemorating a unit called the Prima Fida Vardulorum Equitata, the first faithful Vardulian cavalry. That inscription dates to the 3rd century CE. Alas, it's almost impossible to know anything more of the unit's history, other than what's referenced in other inscriptions in the same fort. It's also unknown whether ethnically constituted units maintained their ethnic identity over time. But at some point, a unit of Vardulians was recruited into the Roman army and stationed far from home, in the cold and wet of Northumberland. The last inscription reference to the Prima Vardulorum cohort, from the same site, notes that they served alongside a unit of Sarmatian scouts. And that is a compelling and romantic image. These two groups from the furthest possible corners of the empire, doing their military duty in another far corner of it. It all speaks of the Varduli and Vascones as a people who were integrated into the Roman system, fulfilled their military commitments, and participated in at least local and regional economies, if not the broader imperial one. At the same time, they maintained their own language and as much of their culture as they could. A story like that could be told of 100 other languages and cultures, all around the various corners of the Roman world. By the 4th century, connection to Roman culture inevitably brought along Christianity. The Christianization of the Basques is just as contentious and historically shrouded as any other story, I tell you, and I'm sorry about it. The mystery has given rise to some amusing theories, though. From the 16th through 19th centuries, fads for antiquarianism and romanticism and nationalism were all influential in the Basque country just as they were throughout Europe, and scholars attempted to fit the Basques into their own framework of the European story. One argument was advanced that Euskara had been the language spoken in the Garden of Eden. Another used features of the language to show that the revelation of the Gospels had been accepted by the Basques before any other people. Modern, more scientific historical research, also known as boring, has pretty much blown those ideas out of the water. Before we talk about the actual story of Christianity in the Basque country, though, I should take some stab at describing what came before. And just as with the Goths, so very, very long ago, sources are sparse and difficult to interpret, with the added complication of a living folklore and mythology that might, or might not, represent a survival of ancient tradition. Strabo, that Roman geographer of ours, noted that the Vascones and Cantabrians were admired for their skill at soothsaying. The Celtiberians further south worshipped a secret god in nighttime rituals, and that idea is sometimes applied to the pre-Christian Basques as well. Archaeologically, what we have is thin gruel indeed. There were certainly a few temples in Roman style, though exact dedications are pretty much impossible to determine. The Varduli military units are associated with the Roman goddess Minerva, which may represent a Romanized equivalent of a local goddess or may just be a coincidence. Small altars are found in settlements, which are likely dedicated to the genius loci of the particular village. As for a more generalized pantheon, only two are attested in the archaeological record, called Ilurberixus and Lacubigus. Lacubigus may not be a Basque name, but there is an altar discovered at Uhe, which is south of Pamplona, and I probably mispronounced horrifically. It was erected in fulfillment of a vow made to the god, and his name suggests that he was some kind of water deity, but more than that we can't say for certain. That leaves Ilurberixus, a name found on two altars, one on each side of the mountains, and tentatively thought to mean the New Hawthorn. It's possible that this is evidence of some form of tree worship, but there's no clear evidence of such practices anywhere else. All of that is fairly disappointing and has led many to attempt to reconstruct a pantheon and a mythology from later sources and folklore. This is not uncommon for cultures where little pre-Christian material survives, and it has accelerated in the last 50 years or so, thanks to the popularity of neo-pagan movements. In the Basque case, we find stories of a mother goddess named Mari with a consort named Sugar. Orko is the god of thunder, and so on, and a host of supernatural beings like giants, spirits, and dragons. It's all fascinating, and it could be the subject of a whole podcast series, or podcast, on its own. It probably is. But it's not the most scholarly approach, and I tend to be skeptical of the substrate theory it's based on. That's that idea that modern folk tales contain and transmit pre-Christian religious ideas. Linguistics can also be used to get some hint of the previous pantheon. For example, the Basque sky god Urtzi seems to be mostly based on back formation from words related to the sky. It's all a rabbit hole, and rather than carry it any further, I'm going to stick to what the archaeology confirms, that I've already said, and move on. Christianity arrived, institutionally at least, by the end of the 4th century. A diocese was established at Calahorra by then, at the southern edge of the region. The Bishop of Pamplona signed the Acts of the Council of Toledo in 589, and that's the first appearance of that diocese in the historical record. But the presence of bishops and churches in larger towns does not necessarily translate to full-throated conversion of the people, especially in the mountains and valleys. No evidence appears of church infrastructure anywhere except on the fringes. Even the bishopric of Basque-ing cannot be confidently dated before the 9th century, and it was relatively well connected to the fertile plains of Aquitaine, so you would think we would see it. The best guess for the story of Basque conversion probably is of another gradual process of diffusion from the neighboring territories, with the process complete by the 9th or 10th century, and possibly even later. Today, the largest religious festival in the Basque country is the Festival of San Fermin in Pamplona, and it runs from July 6th through the 14th, and it features the famous running of the bulls. Fermin is one of Pamplona's two patron saints. His name is Firminus, originally, and he was reportedly the son of a Roman of senatorial rank named Firmus, who lived sometime in the 3rd century. Firmus was convinced of the truth of Christianity, and he traveled to Toulouse to be baptized by Saint Saturninus. He convinced Saturninus to return with him to Pamplona, where he preached and converted 40,000 people in 3 days. His son, Firminus, then, was raised a Christian and consecrated in Toulouse as well, before heading to northern Gaul as a missionary, where he was martyred. The problem is that this story does not appear anywhere before the 9th century, and doesn't match up with any of the historical persecutions of its supposed time. The story is, in fact, a fabrication by the archbishops of Toulouse in an effort to essentially create subsidiaries, patron saints who were in some way descended or connected to their own patron, Saturninus in this case, increasing that saint's prestige, and by extension the prestige of the saint's cathedral. A similar thing occurred with Saint Eugenius of Toledo, who was said to be a disciple of Saint Denis, and who was in fact mythical. It wasn't uncommon for these saints to be adopted by their supposed homelands, as in the case of Saint Fermin, and with considerable enthusiasm. Genuine early martyrs and heroes are to be found, though, and can be found in the work of Prudentius, a Christian poet of the early 5th century and one of the great literary figures of late classical Spain. Prudentius was born around 348. His birthplace has been claimed by Zaragoza, Calahorra, and Vitoria, with Calahorra as the current scholarly front-runner. His 12-part work, the Parastephanon, was composed to celebrate the consecration of Calahorra's cathedral around the year 400, and celebrates a collection of Iberian and other martyrs. He is the only source for the lives of some of these saints, including some I've mentioned before, like Eulalia of Merida, and Saints Emetarius and Caledonius, the patrons of Calahorra. Unlike the story of Firminus, the stories recounted by Prudentius match the patterns of persecution that swept the empire in the reigns of Decius and Diocletian, around 250 and 303 to 306, respectively. Today, Calahorra is technically in the province of La Rioja, and so outside the official Basque territories, but Strabo did identify it as a town of the Vascones, and the last lines of Prudentius' story of Emetarius and Caledonius tell us that it was still the case in 400. Quote, "Believe ye now, ye Vascones, once dull pagans, how holy was the blood which cruel superstition sacrificed. This blessing the Saviour himself bestowed for our advantage when he consecrated the martyrs' bodies in our town, where they now protect the folk who dwell by Ebro's waters." End quote. All of this reinforces the picture of a Basque region that was a peacefully integrated part of the Christian Roman Empire. It was a bit of a backwater, but the cities like Calahorra and Pamplona were capable of producing sophisticates like Prudentius. The pagans of the mountains were probably viewed with some suspicion, but there's no hint of systemic violence or threat from them. It is jarring, then, to read accounts of the 6th and 7th centuries. Suddenly, Pamplona's walls and relics offer protection from a twofold threat: heretics and the Vascones. For these 2 centuries and beyond, every mention of the Basque tribes is in the context of military actions against them by both Frankish and Visigothic rulers. It seems like a radical change coming about very quickly. For an explanation, we need to review the state of things in Hispania as the Western Empire entered its final century. The Rhine frontier broke in 406. Vandals, Suevi, and Alans poured into and across Gaul. At about the same time, the rebel Constantine III crossed over from Britannia and made himself ruler of Gaul, pushing also into Hispania. He replaced the garrisons in the Pyrenees with his own barbarian mercenaries, and in 509 these allowed the Germanic armies to cross over into Hispania. Whether it was delicious malice or incompetence, we don't know, but Hispania quickly passed out of reach of imperial control. Counterattacks by the Visigoths were partially successful, but they were withdrawn and settled in Aquitaine, and the Suevi and Vandals were masters of the peninsula. Only the Ebro Valley and eastern coast cities remained in imperial hands. If Calahorra and Pamplona still paid taxes and were loyal to Rome, it was suddenly from the fringes, and at the furthest end of a line of communication that could only pass down the Ebro. A frontier had appeared almost overnight. Thanks to the efforts of Majorian, Rome's grip on Tarraconensis and the coast, and possibly the Basque Country, was strengthened, but the Visigoth kingdom of Toulouse remained in the north. We've talked about all of this before, of course. I have talked quite a bit about the settlement of the Visigoths and never really clearly answered the question, why were the Visigoths withdrawn from Hispania and settled in Aquitaine? There's no clear answer, but the accepted theory these days has generally been that it was to answer the threat of the Bagaudae, who you may remember, who were large-scale bandit armies threatening the economic underpinnings of the local elites. The problem is that in Gaul, Bagaudae activity was strongest in the Alps and in Brittany. Placing an army in Aquitaine to combat those threats would be geographically nonsensical. There were Bagaudae activities in Tarraconensis too, but no clear suggestion that these were led or conducted mainly by Basques on a large scale. There may have been Basques among them, and there's no indication of Basque raids north of the mountains into Aquitaine, so it's unlikely that the Visigothic settlement was meant to deter them. In fact, the Basques appear more often as the victims of violence than as its instigators. The Suevic king Ricarius raided and devastated the lands of the Vascones on the way back from marrying a Visigothic princess, which is quite a non-standard approach to honeymooning. Such disruptions could be severe. The Roman army, had been withdrawn from the region in 411, which impacted the local economy, as a huge driver of demand had been removed. The area of land under cultivation contracted, and shepherds now had fewer outlets for their wool, milk, and cheese. Pamplona and Calahorra remained, but Iruña was abandoned sometime before 450, as were several of the villages that have been excavated. Sudden, enforced poverty, with no clear hope of improvement, will tend to lead to desperate measures. The Vascones may never have risen to the levels of Bagaudae armies, but raiding and violence almost certainly became necessary tools of survival in the mountains. As the economic relationship changed, so did the cultural and political. In the 1st century, Strabo had noted Calahorra as the city of the Vascones, and Prudentius, at the end of the 5th century, did the same, but that was the last time anyone would do so. In the Visigothic period, every reference to the Vascones is to a dangerous rural population, who threatened the settled towns of the valleys. They may have shared an ancestry, but the population of the valley no longer saw themselves as related to the populations of the mountains. Language may have played a role in this, as Latin would have been much more common in the cities as the lingua franca of trade and the educated classes, and had much less influence in the hills. We can't be certain about it, but if fewer and fewer people in town spoke Euskara and fewer people in the hills spoke Latin, the language barrier could only enhance the sense of difference. Language may also have had a unifying effect among the people of the hills, and in this period we see the final disappearance of different tribal names. There are no more references to Varduli or Alotriges, they are all Vascones. Whether they accepted such an externally imposed identity we can't know, but they probably saw themselves as different from the lowlanders, and that may have become a more important distinction than that between the various mountain tribes, who at least shared their common language and lifestyle. A similar process occurred in other frontier areas of the Old Empire. In Scotland, for instance, an extensive list of tribes that live north of the Wall is suddenly reduced to just 2 after the Roman collapse. The creation of a Basque identity, then, can be seen not so much as a withdrawal, but as a split. 2 economic and social systems, the urban and the rural, which had existed side by side for centuries, each happy to identify with the other as brothers. But the disruptions of the barbarian invasions and the removal of the imperial drivers of trade led to an economic collapse that led one half to desperation and the other half to label their former brothers as brigands. It's kind of a tragedy, really. In 456, Theodoric II of the Visigoths invaded Hispania and toppled the Suevic kingdom of Rechiar. His brother Euric then invaded again in 472 and captured Tarraconensis, and put an end to Roman influence in Hispania once and for all. Vasconia, the land of the Vascones, became, at least nominally, the subject of the Visigothic kingdom. After 469, there are no contemporary sources for Hispania at all until the emergence of our friends John of Biclaro and Isidore, and so the Basques vanish for a while from written history. And by the time they appear again, their position has changed significantly. The success of the Franks and the retreat of the Visigoths meant that the Basques now occupied a borderland between 2 great rival powers. Such a position can be tenuous, but it also offers opportunities. In 581, a Frankish duke led an army into Vasconia, only to have most of it destroyed. The mission was apparently punitive, vainly seeking redress for earlier raiding. In 587, the Basques then raided into Aquitaine. They destroyed crops, uprooted vines, and took back, with them, produce, livestock, and captives. Why captives? It probably wasn't for slaves for themselves. The economics of the mountain didn't require that kind of labor force, and most of the captives were not probably particularly highly ranked and so weren't worth very much for ransom. But they could be taken south and sold as slaves in the Visigoth kingdom, and the Basques were perfectly placed as a conduit for such a trade in both directions. Visigothic kings periodically campaigned against the Basques, usually pricked by raiding. John of Biclaro reports that Leovigild succeeded in bringing a large part of Vasconia under his control and founding a city there, though the location of said city is up for debate. A later successor, who we haven't talked about yet, named Swinthilla, also campaigned against the Vascones with some success. He also founded a city, which is now called Olite, or Ereberi in Euskara, to serve as a hub for the Vascones that he now called his subjects. What's interesting about that is that Olite is pretty far south of the core highlands, south of Pamplona, and it's unlikely that Swinthilla had the resources to force a large-scale relocation, so the Vascones he had defeated may have actually occupied the surrounding countryside prior to his military action. Swinthilla may have been unable to drive them out militarily, and the town was founded as a necessary center of trade and control. It would appear, then, that the Basques were actually spreading back southward from their mountain strongholds during that period. Similar processes were at work in the north as well, as Frankish dukes mounted ever larger campaigns against the Basques that threatened Aquitaine. Such a ratcheting up of military response suggests that previous efforts had been ineffective. The 7th century is the darkest of dark ages generally, and even more so for the Pyrenees. In general terms, I can say that Basque influence of some kind seems to have spread north of the mountains, most concentrated to the south of the river Lardor, going by place name evidence mainly. In this spreading influence are the origins of the region of Gascony, which is culturally distinct from the rest of Aquitaine. The nature of that influence, though, and whether it involved population movement or our old friend cultural diffusion, is hidden from us. And on the Spanish side for the 7th century, the picture is no clearer. It's possible the region came under direct Frankish rule for a time, but the sources for that are so garbled as to be basically useless. There is a story of a Christian bishop who crossed the mountains in the 630s and attempted to convert the inhabitants, but only met failure and hostility. He did manage to complete the crossing, and enjoy the hospitality of the local bishop, probably in Pamplona. So paganism was still strong in the 630s, and probably still strong in 711, when the Visigothic kingdom fell to Muslim invaders from Africa. That invasion would add a whole new layer of problems for the Basque historian, and I am not going to dig into it now. I will probably end up coming back to it when we get there, whenever it is that we get there. And well, there you go. I told you it was going to run into the sand at the end. Sorry about the long episodes, the longest I've done in quite some time, but I wanted to get this all done in one. That completes our current series on Hispania. I was alarmed to discover that I've spent 8 episodes on it, and it didn't feel like that many. We've come right to the beginning of the 7th century in our main narrative, which puts us far ahead of any of the other threads, and to be honest, I'm not sure where to take it from here. I could take the plunge and get down into the insanity of the Frankish kingdoms, of the Merovingians, or I could take us back to Italy and see how the Ostrogoths and Romans have been getting along since the end of the First Gothic War, though there's probably a spoiler in that name. Obviously, I'm going to do both eventually, it's just a question of which we do first. So why don't you tell me? I'm going to put a poll on the episode on Spotify that you can respond to. I'll also see if I can figure out how to put one on the website, or you can email me and leave a comment or a review on Facebook or Instagram. You can get email to me through the contact page at www.darkagespod.com. You can also search Facebook for the Dark Ages Podcast and the Instagram handle, which is @DarkAgesPod. I'm also on Threads, by the way, on the same handle, and I'm quite a bit more loosey-goosey there with what I post than the other platforms, so take a look, if you want. A couple of things for you to know so that you are an informed voter on the poll. The Franks are complex, but we will have Gregory of Tours finally as our first-person narrator, rather than what he has been, which is the odd tangential reference. So there will be complexity, but there will also be color and personalities. So that'll be fun. In Italy, there is some color, but our old friend Procopius is no longer on the ground firsthand, and his narrative gets a little patchy, so then we have to look elsewhere. It also includes the arrival of the Lombards in Italy, bringing a whole nother barrel of fun. So you tell me, which do we do first? And finally, as I run out of momentum, and you probably run out of patience, I have been extremely remiss in thanking those of you that contribute through Ko-Fi.com, or Ko-Fi.com, however they want me to say it. Regular donators Paul, Scott, Jesse, Brendan, Alex, Dusty, John, Barchester, and Micaiah, whose continued support is humbling and very appreciated. And to new donors, Michael and the very generous Andrew and Dominic. Thanks to you all, and thank you all for listening. It would make no sense without you. Until next time, take care.